So, welcome everyone. This is Intro to Linocut Printmaking with Marie, proudly co-hosted Papercut Zine Library. Papercut Zine Library is normally we operate out of Democracy Center in Cambridge, but we're closed due to the pandemic. But some of the projects that we work on is these monthly skill shares. We do a girls' skate day, trying to get girls on skateboards, and kind of carve out space for girls to have their own space to do skateboarding. It's like a dominated sport. And we have our digital library, which where Marie is actually the catalog director and is working on making our digital virtual library accessible to everyone through TinyCat, which is awesome. Yeah, so just to introduce Marie, Marie is a lover of Linocut printmaking and has been making Linocut prints since 2014 and is passionate about all things art, DIY, making, and zines, which is super cool. And we're really excited that she's going to give us this awesome presentation today.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Sounds good. Let me figure out how to share my screen. All right, so we're going to talk Linocut printmaking. And as a disclaimer, I've been doing this since 2014, and what that really means is I took a high school class for art, and we did Linocut printmaking then, and that's where I kind of caught the bug. But I think Linocut is one of those things that you can pick it up and put it down and play around with it, and have you can do really cool things fairly simply. So today we're going to talk about kind of a quick intro to what is Linocut, and I'll cover some techniques that you can do to make your prints more interesting. And then we'll jump, hopefully sooner rather than later, into a demo where I'll also talk about options you have for tools and materials, depending on how far you want to get into printmaking. So as a bit of background, what is Linocut? It is one of a family of relief printmaking types, which is where the image that you're going to print is raised up from the surface. So you'll take some sort of material, carve it away. Traditionally, it would be woodcut, and then Linocut is an offshoot of this where you use a piece of linoleum or soft rubber. You carve away the stuff that you don't want to be printed, and then put ink on what's left, put paper on the block, and then you get basically a giant stamp. And this is also referred to as block printing. So you'll hear me talk about carving your block, and that just means carving whatever piece of material you're working with. And so yeah, as a bit of historical inspiration, woodcut is kind of the closest thing to Linocut before we get into carving rubber. And it mostly started in Asia, in Japan with the ukiyo-e prints, and in India, woodblock prints are often used for fabric. Same in China, and actually China had woodblock printing and developed movable type as an offset of that way before it made its way to Europe, which is really cool. And then on the right is one of my favorite artists, Sensi Escher, does a lot of really cool things with woodcuts, so you can really push the limits of this medium a lot. Another in the family of kind of block printing is carving metal or using metal to make prints. So on the left, you've got examples of metal cut, where you carve away the metal and then you put ink on it and press the paper, same deal. On the right, you have relief etchings, which also use metal, but are a little different in the sense that you would scratch away the surface of the metal and then apply like an acid or a mordant to eat away more of the metal. And then when you apply ink, the ink seeps into the places that have been eaten away. And so you end up with a slightly different kind of printing process, but still cool. And then kind of the most accessible version in the block printing family is rubber stamps and potato prints. You can basically carve anything that you can put ink on, press it onto paper, make a print. There's a pretty fine line between rubber stamps and Linocut, since you can use like rubber sheets for making Linocuts. I think the division that I usually draw is like with linoleum blocks, you usually carve the block, you put the block on the table, you put the paper on top, and you press that way. Whereas with stamps, they're usually smaller, so you might carve a little thing, put the paper on the table, put the block on top. But it gets blurry and it doesn't really matter. But that's kind of the terms you might use. And so finally, Linocut, which is what we'll talk about today. Linocuts, like we said, very close to woodcut, but some key differences are that it's a lot easier to carve because the material is softer. This also means that Linocut kind of degrades over time more quickly than wood does. So as you continue like using the same block for printing a bunch of multiple prints, you might see that they start to get less precise over time with Linocut, especially if you're working in like warm weather where the rubber will start to degrade faster. Yeah, just some examples of some cool, very different styles of Linocut printing. And we'll talk a little bit of what goes into these prints now. So a couple of techniques that you may wish to think about as you're doing your own Linocut prints. You can do a lot with a single block. You can carve like a very detailed block and then ink it, stamp it, be ready to go, like the top kind of left examples. You can put 2 colors of ink or more onto your plate and then make a gradient, and that can give you kind of a cool effect. You can ink the same block in different colors and press it like multiple times to get that sort of 3D effect on the right. So there's a lot you can do if you're working with something small. Similarly, you can kind of use tessellation if you have a small block and a large piece of paper, play around with repetition. On the left is this artist that I've been following on Instagram for a while now. You might actually see a lot of their work show up throughout these slides, not for any particular reason other than I think it's really cool. So in the left, they're using like a mandala shape and repeating this kind of pie slice around. And you'll notice also that they have these small circular stamp sized things that they can fill into the circular hole in the larger pie slice. So you can play around sort of with intersecting pieces and think about how you can make parts interchangeable almost within your prints and get some really cool effects. In particular, I want to talk about there's 2 kind of main ways that you can do multicolor prints. On the left is an example of this, which is kind of a simpler one. You basically just figure out where you want each color to go, and then you carve a separate piece of linoleum for that. This is nice because you can make as many of these prints as you want. You always have like the pieces of rubber on hand or linoleum on hand, and you can make them as complicated or as simple as you want. On the right is an example of what's called reduction prints. And with this, you actually destroy the linoleum block as you go. So you would start out printing the lightest color that you want to print. So actually, you start out by figuring out what your artwork wants to look like. And then you figure out, okay, I need to go kind of build up this image from back to front, starting with the lightest color and ending with the darkest color on top. So you'll notice in this example, they start out with kind of a big rectangle of linoleum, and they know that they want some parts of the image to be white. And so that's the part they start out by carving away. Then they ink the block in yellow, press it onto paper, maybe 30 times, and then they say, okay, great. I'm gonna have 30 prints at most, because once you carve this block more, you can't go back to that step. So next they would carve away a little bit more to get the stripes in the background, more details of the pine cone, ink that in orange, put it on top of the piece of paper with yellow on top, and then repeat 30 times, carve a little bit more away to get the fine details of the brown, put that on top, repeat 30 times, and then at the end you would have some piece of art that looks like what you have at the bottom right. And if you are really good at planning, you can make some really kind of detailed artworks with this. So this image shows kind of the final piece being built up over time. So you'll see they started with the light yellow, they add a slightly darker green, then deep green, then blue, and at the end you get up with this multi-layered piece of artwork. So I'm gonna pause here and take any questions about sort of the techniques or the background that I went through.
questions yet in the chat. Does anyone have any questions about this technique? I know when Maria was showing me, I was like slightly confused, but I think that pinecone one explained it a little better for me.
Ooh, are registration marks hidden in that example? Someone asks. Really great question, Mariano. I would imagine, yeah, they're hidden so for anyone that's interested, registration marks are how you would align your multicolored print as you're printing it. So you have a big piece of paper and then you have your block print that you want to position relative to the piece of paper in some way. There's a number of ways to do this. I didn't actually go too deep into this in my slides, but one way I've seen is like people will mark out on their table, they'll like tape a piece of paper to their table, they'll place a block on top and like affix it down so it doesn't move. And then when they're placing the piece of paper they actually want to print, they will align it to the one on the table so that every time you want the paper to be positioned correctly relative to the block. There's another way to do registration that has, you can buy these tabs that you can actually like attach. It looks like a little tab with a hole in it, and you can attach them to your table, and then you can attach them to your paper, and then you end up with kind of like a hinge that you would slot your paper into. I can find a photo at the end for it. Mariana says that makes sense, which I'm glad because I feel like I rambled a little bit. And then, so before we go too far, Jasmine wanted to see a life-size black and white print. I'm guessing it's this one. It's pretty huge, must have taken a lot of time. The way you would print this is, I think at this size, you would be just kind of laying it out on the floor or on a big table and like manually controlling the paper to get it to lay down nicely. Just because it's a very huge print. You might be able to use a very large printing press, and I'll have some photos of those towards the end, kind of when we talk about actually stamping your print. Any other questions I should cover?
Mona asked, is it just trial and test, or are there general methods or standard practices? I guess you sort of answered that, but.
Yeah, I think at least for me, approaching this as like an amateur, just doing this for fun, for me, it's usually more trial and test. I can actually talk about some ways that I learned exactly what you shouldn't do when doing a multi-piece, like multicolor print, like on the left. There are probably best practices, and if you research before you get started, you can definitely find some nice guides and tutorials on YouTube and stuff. But I think this is a medium that lends itself well to like playing around and figuring stuff out if you're just doing it for fun. All right, I think we're gonna keep going. I think we're doing all right on time, but I wanna make sure we get to printing. So the steps to making a Linocut print are pretty straightforward. You want to draw or find a design, get it onto the material you're carving, carve it, and then apply ink and print. Most of you already know this, but we're going to go through it and I'll talk about kind of the tools you might want to have while you're getting started. So let me switch to showing you a bit of my desk. And yeah, so you have some options for printing material. You can get kind of the classic Hessian back linoleum, which looks like this. You can see this is kind of a well-used piece of material. It's got Hessian on the back, so it's pretty thin, as you'll notice. It's also very stiff, which can be nice because as you carve it, you can do some nice stuff like, let me carve deeper. So you can cut and then you can just stop and it'll snap off.
I'm not seeing your desk.
Oh, right. Thanks. Let me fix that. You can tell I don't use Zoom very often. How's this?
Good, yeah.
Yeah. So here's a piece of Hessian back linoleum. Here's the backing. Here's the linoleum. And I'll demo again what I did. The nice part about this is it's a lot easier to carve because you don't have to worry about controlling as you leave the cut. You can kind of just go and then stop and it'll snap off in kind of a more or less straight edge. I'm trying to figure out how to show that. And that can be cool because you can do some techniques like these triangles on the top right, or if you use a differently shaped scoop, you can have sort of rounded effects, which is kind of nice. The other option is kind of a softer rubber. This is what you would usually see, I think, in a high school, or at least this is what I started out using. You can see the sketch for a print I did recently. This one's nice because it's two-toned, so as you cut away, you can kind of start to see the underlying color, but you'll also notice that it's a lot more stretchy because it's a lot more flexible. So the downside to this is you can tear it and it can get kind of ugly looking if you're not careful. So you want to be doing a lot more control as you leave the cut. You can also, as mentioned elsewhere, use a big eraser because it's the same rubber. And so you'll have the same benefits and troubles as with the soft linoleum. Let me see if I can bring this closer. Yeah. So next you want to use a carving tool. There's a couple of kind of classic options for this. Apologies if you can hear the truck in the background. You can get sort of the classic Speedball gouge with interchangeable heads. So the back of it opens up. You can have these like different size gouges. This one's really wide. It's good for cleaning out a big area of space, or you can have sort of medium or narrow cuts. I'm gonna go with the mid-size one, I think, and it has an attachment sort of like a drill where you can, it's hard to see. Yeah, you can slot it in and then tighten to a fix and work from there. There's also some more kind of woodcut style gouges where they're not interchangeable, but they are sharp and good. And then of course, as advertised, you can use an X-Acto knife carefully, very carefully, don't hurt yourself. I'm gonna be a bad example because I can't find my X-Acto knife. So instead I have a big box cutter, but the principle is the same. You want a sharp X-Acto knife, and it's gonna be a couple more steps because the benefit of the gouge is it's got this V shape, so you can kind of scoop away material. With the X-Acto knife, it can be good for precision cuts, but you're gonna have to do kind of twice as much cutting because you're manually cutting this V. So what I usually do for the X-Acto knife shape is, say I'm trying to cut this line, I would cut away from the line. So I'm angling kind of this way as I cut so that the top where my knife exits the material is where the line I want to cut is. And then to get that material in, I would angle it the other way and very carefully kind of cut that away. So it's twice as much work, but it is doable. And this is really useful for detail cuts like sharp corners, like right angles and things like that. So I might do like this kind of thing and then carefully do a bit of surgery to remove this piece. And you'll see I got like a nice sharp corner there, even though I need to then continue cutting. Obviously, you can imagine this isn't as handy for querying out whole surfaces of material. So if you can, it is worth investing in a gouge tool. Any questions on that before I move on?
I don't see any questions right now.
Okay, then we'll keep on going. We'll talk about ink.
Someone someone just said, what's a good gouge to start with?
What's a good gouge? Honestly, the one I've used all my life is Speedball, and it's not a bad one. They're nice. They last a long time. I haven't actually even sharpened these in all the years I've had them, although you eventually will need to, especially if you start like cutting wood or something like that. Yeah, I think Speedball's a good go-to. You can get them at like Michael's, maybe, definitely Blick, and that's where I got all my linoleum as well. Yeah, thanks for your question. So as we go, I want to actually do a little demo for y'all. There's two things to keep in mind when carving linoleum. One is that as you carve your design, you want it to look backwards. That's because you're gonna be, it's kind of like a mirror effect, right? Ooh. I'm gonna go on a different screen and throw y'all off your rhythm. So this looks backwards, but when I put ink on it and I press it down on the paper, it's gonna come away mirrored and it will look correct. So that's kind of reminder number one, is carve backwards, print forwards. So the other thing to keep in mind as you're making prints is,
Oh, Angelina asked, do you need to put something down underneath to avoid cutting the table?
You probably should. I usually do. I usually put a small cutting board underneath, just because in case my hand goes wild and I carve off the rubber or the linoleum. But in theory, you shouldn't be cutting through. The only time you really cut through the linoleum is if you're trying to cut away a piece of it to make like a smaller stamp. But yes, you should probably have one of the cutting boards on hand. That's a good call. The other kind of small technique thing I wanted to make mention of is you can either carve away the lines of your design, or you can carve away around the thing you want to print. So let me kind of give a better example of that. Let me grab a pencil. So say we want to print like a little heart, right? It's almost Valentine's Day. There is two ways, or there's at least two ways we can draw this heart. We can draw it like this, or like this, but different. And what I mean by that is you can choose to have this part that I'm shading be the part that prints, so you'll have like a solid print heart. You can choose to have everything but the lines be printed, so you have like a white outlined heart and then a colored block around it, which is, these two are very similar. You could start out like this and then cut away the rest of your material to make it become this. Or you can choose to have just these lines print. And to do that, you need to cut away this area and this area. So those are some things to think about as you start carving. Usually, when I carve designs, I like to actually shade the things that I want to stay so that I remember to carve in the right place. I've definitely meant to do this, but then started carving like this and been like, oh no, I've cut away the part that I wanted to print because I forgot what I was trying to do. So yeah, anyway.
Marie, somebody asked what your favorite material to cut on is and why that is.
Sure. It depends. I only recently started using, I was a diehard soft rubber fan before. I used that for this the promotional material for this workshop. I think the soft rubber is nice for smaller prints or stamps, I guess, at that point. And the reason for that is it's kind of unwieldy to work with once you get above a certain size. You eventually might want to think about affixing, like attaching the rubber to a piece of wood or some other stiff material so that you can like press it evenly, or just even move it, and detach the paper from it better, because there's nothing worse than like having a big slab of rubber on the table and pressing your paper onto the inked block and then trying to peel off the paper, and then the block comes with it, and then you're like struggling to separate them. So I think the stiff material is actually, the like traditional linoleum is quite nice for more detailed work. So here's a multi-part piece I did. I can show you the final result in a sec. This one was nice because it let me get super detailed, and it came out kind of roughly like this. The downside was like, because it was so small, it was a little bit harder to press into the paper. I think if you had a big stiff block, that would work better. So it kind of depends. You might have your own preferences, but that's kind of what I'm still playing around with it, as you can see. Yeah, so I want to talk ink a little bit, and also paper. You should probably think about getting printmaking specific paper. It's usually stiffer and like thicker than regular paper, which makes it easier to peel away from the block. This is the example I'm using today. It's just whatever was on sale at Michael's, I think, but this one's like almost cardstock thickness or weight, which is really nice. And I'm going to do something that you're really not supposed to do in printmaking, which is I'm going to ink something in the same area that I'm printing. Ideally, you want to keep those two activities quite separate so that you don't smudge your paper, which is very easy to do, at least for me. I'll probably just print the same logo that Gabby designed because we have it on hand. And so as far as inks go, I like to use a combination. As I'm working, I'll usually use kind of this cheap stamp pad sort of thing. And the reason for that is it's really easy to apply it. I don't want to be rolling out ink while I'm still carving my block. This one is like less messy. So let me actually carve a little thing for y'all. So say we want to make this block. I'm gonna cut away this piece of linoleum. We figured out our design. I'm gonna quickly carve it. You don't want to have your finger in front of the carving tool. That's like a good safety tip. You're carving away from yourself always. Another tip is if you have, you'll see me just like pick away at the rubber because I'm cheating. But if you have an area like this where it comes into a point, you want to use the V shape of your tool to cut it out. You never want to be carving in towards the shape either, because it's very easy to lose control and not stop at the right time. Yeah. So let's say we get this heart more or less carved. And then we want to see what it looks like. So what I'll usually do is I'll ink it with a stamp pad. So take my green stamp pad, try not to get it on the surface. This is why you would usually do it somewhere else. And so you can already see kind of there's some unevenness. It doesn't quite look like we want. But what I'll usually do is just take scrap sketchbook paper and I'll stamp it to see how the stamp behaves. In general, anytime you're pressing a stamp or a block from above, so there's different things you want to do if you're pressing a rubber stamp versus a linoleum block, and I'll talk about that in a second. You can kind of see it's a little bit uneven, so because I used the sort of ink pad, there's not that much ink left on here. I'm not too worried about getting on it on my hands, so I can just quickly keep iterating, carve more away and be like, okay, I don't actually want that there, and so on. And then once we have the block like reasonably carved the way we want it, so that would be something like this, that's when I would switch to using kind of the proper Speedball ink. You'll notice that name comes up a lot. They're a pretty good brand. So this is the set that I have, just a block printing starter set. You can mix your own colors. This notably is water-based ink, so it is great in that it's really easy to clean up. You can wash it off of your blocks when you're done. You can wash it off of your brayer, which is the other thing you want. This thing, also Speedball brand. It's basically a roller, but specifically made for rolling out ink. You'll notice it's hard rubber. And yeah, so the other thing I wanted to mention about water-based ink is if you want to print on fabric, you will definitely want special fabric printing ink. Speedball also makes it. There's probably other brands, but they're kind of the most common one. And that one needs to be cured by putting it under heat, I think, or just putting it in the dryer maybe. There's special instructions for the fabric ink. But the key to remember is you can use fabric ink on fabric and you can use it on paper. It'll work it'll be slightly more goopy, but it'll still work. You can only use paper printing ink on paper. It'll just wash out of your fabric, which is not what you want. So once we get to the rolling the ink step, you want some sort of surface to roll it out on. I have some spare acrylic lying around as part of other projects that I do. In the past, I've used the back of a cereal box for this. I wouldn't recommend that actually. What you really want is something that's waterproof so that you can wash it between ink colors, and durable so that like it won't degrade over time. It's as smooth as possible. So either acrylic or like glass is common. You can basically just go to a thrift store, buy like a cheap picture frame and take the glass or plastic out of it and use that. That's what I would recommend. So once you do that, you would put your inking surface onto the table. You take your ink, you put like a very small glob. Obviously the amount of ink you're using depends on the size of your block, but you really want to start out with as little as possible. You can always add more. You can't take away the ink, or you know, it's like hard. You can scrape it up with a palette knife, but that's more effort than you want to go through. I probably should have used a different color, but here we are. And then what you do is you would roll it out in kind of one direction. My goal with this is to cover this circumference of the sprayer pretty much fully, ideally. So you start out, you roll it in one direction, trying not to hit my tripod, and then you roll it in a perpendicular direction. And so you really want to end up with kind of a nice square-ish area of ink. And you'll notice that this is mostly well covered. That's fine. I'll have to like aim carefully to ink my block properly. But you'll notice there's like a bit of texture to the block. There's not too much ink on there. You kind of want it to look like that. Same with the brayer. There's enough ink that it will get onto the block, but not enough that it'll ooze down the sides of the thing that of like your carved surface, because once it starts doing that, your prints start to look sloppy. Then we find our block. You ink it. Again, kind of rolling in one direction at first, trying to get the ink off of the whole roll of the brayer. Probably could have even put a little bit more ink in this case. But ideally, when you're done, you want kind of the raised surface of your block to look similar to that texture I showed you on the surface of the acrylic itself. This might be not quite enough, but we'll go with it. So once you've rolled it out, you would take your paper. And so this is where I'm demonstrating kind of the stamp approach. If you have a small block, you want to put it, you can easily align it to where you want it to be on the paper. I'm not really diving into registration in this case a ton. I can talk to it later though. But if you're doing this approach, I found, or I've learned that it helps to have a piece of, again, flat material to press down on your stamp so that you can apply even pressure. You can do this with your hand, but you run the risk of kind of like pushing it or almost squishing it unevenly in some places, especially if you have like a part that sticks out. It might squish down more than others. So I have in this case just like a piece of clear acrylic, and you would press down, you know, kind of evenly. And with any luck, we'll have a nice print. It's all right. There's not quite enough ink on that, but you see the general idea.
We have a couple questions, Marie.
Yes, let's do it.
So someone said, Jasmine said, if you were to stick that onto a piece of wood, what glue would you use?
Ooh, that's a good question. I haven't actually done that, but I think I've seen people for smaller, from what I've read, for smaller blocks, you might be able to get away with using double-sided tape of certain brands. If you want it to be permanently affixed, crazy glue probably would work. Yeah, I think any one of those would be good options. Depends on how permanent you want to be attached, but I haven't actually done this myself.
And then we have one more question from Natalie, wants to know, what's the advantage of using that technique over a stamp pad?
Right, so for bigger blocks, you're gonna be sitting there dabbing at this for a while. And between every time you press another print, you want to re-ink your block. So it's just kind of gonna get annoying, I think. It'll also depend on the effect you're trying to go for. If you ink something properly, you can get like a nice rich color. You can notice kind of like there's a thick layer of ink on there. While the stamp pad, it still looks kind of like a stamp, even where I put like a good amount of ink on there. So advantages, I think, are speed and richness of color. With inks, you're also not limited to the colors that are in the box because you can mix them. Whereas with the stamp pad, you've got what you have on the stamp pad, and you can maybe try to mix them by inking it with multiple pads, but then they'll get dirty, and then that's probably not what you want. So it gives you more flexibility, I would say.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool. All right, if there's no other questions. Oh yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention is on this slide, I have slow drying acrylic paint as kind of the very low end side of things that you can do. I've definitely done this usually for the prototyping step, like as I'm carving, I will apply some slow drying paint. The reason this is not as desirable compared to the actual printmaking ink is acrylic tends to be the wrong consistency. Like it's either too thick if it's nice acrylic. If it's cheap acrylic, then it's too watery and it'll like smear more easily when you're printing. Often it dries too quickly, so you'll like apply ink or apply paint to your block and it'll just dry by the time you go to press it onto the paper, which is silly. Yeah, there's definitely a benefit to ink over paint. And then I think, let me know if there's a question, but.
Asked is the first Speedball one the same that you would use for screen printing?
So I would guess not, given that it says block printing ink, but I also haven't done screen printing. Let me know if anyone in the audience has more experience with screen printing. I think you.
Some. It kind of looks similar, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know if it would work. You could probably use screen printing ink for block printing. I doubt you could use block printing ink for screen printing. That would be my guess.
Janine said screen printing ink is more fluid. Yes, and someone else said that it's more liquidy.
Okay, so you could probably do it, but it might get a little messy and it might not work quite as well. Yeah, block printing ink, it is a little bit more thick, partly due to it not drying as fast, and also so that it's like sticks to your block just enough to get on there and little enough that you can get it onto the paper after. All right, I wanted to briefly touch on barons and what you might want to use those for. So this is where we get into kind of when you would do a big block print. So I have an example here. So I had this giant print from way back when, and you're not gonna, this is the soft rubber, so it's super floppy. You really don't want to be putting this on top of your paper. So you'd have it down on the desk, you would ink it, and then the question becomes like, how do I press it down evenly when it's so big? You can use a printing press if you have access to one, and I'll cover that on the next page. But what you would usually do, or some other options you could do, would be to get a baron, which is just a thing that's specially designed to basically rub like this. So you are applying distributing pressure to the surface of your paper so that it presses evenly into the block and gets enough ink. You can get a glass one, that's like the fancy version. Speedball makes one. I don't actually own one. The one Speedball product I am not a user of. You can also use a big wooden spoon for this. I had a regular spoon, which like kind of works. Usually the bigger surface you have touching the surface, the better, which is why you'll see the barons have a flat area. I could probably, in the past I've used like random objects, like I could probably use this thing because it has a flat surface and like rub it too. You can kind of make do.
Rolling pin. That sounds like it might work.
What?
Taylor suggested a rolling pin.
Yeah, a rolling pin would work. That's a good point. I always forget to do this because I only own one brayer, but if you have a second brayer, you can like keep that one clean and use it to roll out the paper into your block. So yeah, good point, Taylor. Thank you. Any other questions?
I think that we're good on questions. There were just some comments talking earlier about the ink, that it matters if the ink was made for printing on paper or fabric, but I don't think any more questions.
Okay. Yeah, let me take a quick look.
Oh, Mona said, I like your Linocut.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Yeah, it was fun to make lots of small cuts. But yeah, so I also briefly wanted to mention, if you have access to it, you can use a printing press for larger blocks. You might find like a print studio, or the one on the right that's low tech, that was on sale on Amazon for like $70. Probably won't get that anytime soon, but it is an option. So there's two kind of major variations that I've seen. The one on the right, it's like a thing on some hinges, so you would press a big flat surface and clamp it down and then release it, and it would just kind of evenly push down on your block. Or similar to the rolling pin method that Taylor described, it's a big old wheel that pulls a bottom plate with your block on the bottom of it and a piece of paper like tucked in between the rolling wheel and the bottom, and just inks it for you. I haven't used these, so I can't quite speak to registration on sort of the big rolling wheel type press. For the kind of to shelf one, I would imagine it's pretty similar to what you would be doing by hand. You would just like lay the paper on top and then carefully press down, making sure not to move anything. Yeah, that's basically all I got for you today. Let me know if there's any questions or comments, concerns. I guess the other thing I can say is like, you can get nice printing paper. You can also get some cool effects by using like random materials for printing. You can do, whatever you have around the house. Just kind of have fun with it.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Marie?
Let me know if you have thoughts on what you're going to print with your newfound knowledge.
Awesome. Everyone says awesome and thank you.
Ooh, are there established styles? Mariano asks. Let's see. I don't know if I'm the best person to ask about this because I mostly get my latest stylistic things from Instagram. There's definitely like some trends. Like you'll see a lot of this kind of floral stuff like from Kelpie Craft. There's definitely a style, but beyond that, it's kind of whatever you can find. Like the one on the right, this piece, this very detailed reduction print is like pretty similar to what you might even see from screen printing or woodblock, I think. I think there was at one point in history where Linocut like wasn't considered an art medium because it was too easy to use and like too accessible. So like the fine arts people were like, it's not cool enough. And then among others, like there's definitely still fine artists that use it. Fine artists as defined by like fine arts circles, like Picasso and Matisse have used it in their own way, but I actually haven't done much research into like specific movements that have come out of Linocut, but it's a very flexible medium, so maybe. Some other questions, I'm also looking at the chat, but feel free to pose them to me, Scabby.
Oh yeah, for sure. Someone was asking about, I don't think you answered this, about GSM for like paper. I think that's paper thickness. Like if there's a thickness.
Let's see, let me find this piece of paper. So the example that I was using earlier, this one, it says 280 GM2. I haven't thought about paper thicknesses in a while, but if that tells you anything, I've definitely seen printmaking paper that's like half the thickness of this, which is actually what I used for this card. You can see it's quite thin. It's like almost printer paper, but still slightly heavier. I think the main thing to look for is like a little bit heavier weight, because if it's too thin, it'll smudge when you peel it away from the block. If it's too smooth, that doesn't work very well. Tracing paper is good for prototyping prints, not so good for making prints on, as I've learned by experience. So you want some texture, usually. You want some weight, a little bit on the more side. But beyond that, I think it's like whatever whatever the style of the print you're going for is. Speedball carver, no instructions, it's not assembling tightly, can you demo? Yes. So yeah, if you have a speedball carver, it unscrews, presumably you've gotten to that point. When you look inside, once it's unscrewed, there's like two pieces, one where the semicircle is attached and one where it's not. You want to slot this bad boy into the side where there's a gap, and then you want to twist to tighten. And it honestly doesn't even have to be that tightened. This maybe like wiggles a little bit, but you mostly just want it to be not going in everywhere, and that's usually good enough. Yeah, hope that helps.
For people wanting to find Marie's work, I'm going to share a slide toward the end with her Instagram. So I think that's your Instagram for your Linocut work.
Sounds good. Yeah. I can also drop. I am Mariette's on Instagram. That's me. And then I think Mariano asks, have you noticed the fact that the medium has affected your own style, the way you need to carve it, or the consistency of the linoleum? Yes, definitely. So I think the rubber, the soft linoleum blocks, I think definitely lend themselves to kind of chunkier things, maybe, if that's a good way to put it. Like, it's harder to carve precisely. Um, I find it really hard to carve letters in this stuff. I later learned that like X-Acto knife is helpful for letters. But in general, I think like I might pick a different medium for a different piece of artwork that I want to do. For example, like this was the Hessian-back linoleum, and it was a lot easier to get very small letters carved out of here. And you can like kind of get inspiration from the medium itself. Like this kind of weird, scary, stripy pattern comes from the fact that like as you carve away, you get a sort of texture, and it's kind of fun to play around with that. And I think this one was also soft linoleum because on the hard linoleum, it's probably going to look more precise, the scratches away. I see Jennifer asks, could you send us the link via Eventbrite on the video recording? I can send the slides for sure. I think the video probably won't be ready for a little while yet. We're a volunteer-run organization, so it takes us a little bit to go through the backlog of videos that we have to edit, but definitely can share the slides, and then you can watch our social for when we post the videos. I think my phone's dead, so that's a good indicator to maybe go to the wrap-up slides. Oh wait, one more question. So Mariano pinged me a question about, do I have an example of how the blocks degrade after lots of use? I can definitely show an example of how they degrade over time. So one other thing to note is like the Hessian-back linoleum will degrade less because it's, in some cases it'll degrade less because it's stiffer. If you start cutting it into small pieces, it does start to fall apart more than the rubber type of linoleum. So maybe another thing to consider is like, do you want many small pieces? You might enjoy or do you just want pieces? Then you might enjoy the rubber linoleum. Do you want a big detailed block? Then maybe the stiff linoleum. Yeah, I don't think I have an example on hand of how stuff degrades. It's more visible like as you're printing. I think like you could maybe tell from the blocks, but more so when you ink it, you press it, and you're like, oh, maybe it's not as sharp anymore. All right. We'll stick around for a little bit after. So Gabby, if you want to take us home, and then we'll hang out if you have any further questions.
For sure. So our upcoming workshop on March 2nd, which it's the first Tuesday of every month, so is going to be about art therapy and zine making. And this is Marie's Instagram. And if you want to reach out to Papercut, the person who was asking about the videos, I think we should be putting those eventually up on our website for everyone to access, like from our past workshops that we've done as well. So you can go to papercutzinelibrary.com. And then our Instagram is Papercut Zine Library. Our Facebook is Papercut Zine Library. And also you can email us at papercut@riseup.net if you have any other questions as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for coming. Hope you had fun.